Wait, so because there's not a lot of casualties, he thinks it's a waste of money. But but how much of it is against logistical stuff? 60%. But isn't that important too? I thought it was, yeah, I think so too. Okay. Yeah. April 14th, 1952. Okay, so the screening has begun. All of the POWs the UN holds are being screened to see if they will forcibly resist repatriation to North Korea or China. And the results after the first few days are, well, they are results that no one on either side expected at all. And Lord alone knows what this means for peace. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week, the communists agreed that the UN could screen the POWs they hold to see how many would forcibly resist repatriation to North Korea or China. And that screening is set up to begin this week, as I just said. US 8th Army Commander Jim Van Fleet was thinking about new, small offensives, and the US Marines were encountering teething problems in their new positions, most often in the form of mines. I said also that the sub-delegation has reconvened at Panmunjom for the peace talks, but the same old arguments are still there, which makes the meetings shorter and shorter and shorter, and they even set a record today, the 14th. Just 15 seconds elapsed between the beginning and the end of the meeting. If no one yields on anything, the staff officers will take over again, and that seems very likely to happen. But let me jump right in with the POW screening, since everyone wants to know how that goes. Okay, the screening of POWs in UN custody to separate those who do not wish to return to North Korea or China begins this week on the 8th. Here's the general process. The prisoner has his clothes and his stuff with him when he comes to the interview area, because if he chooses to not be repatriated, then he's not going back to his former enclosure. There's no need, and it might be dangerous for him. During the interview, the person conducting it, unarmed, tells the prisoner of the disadvantages of non-repatriation, the uncertainty. Think about what might become of his loved ones at home. After that, he is told the communists have offered amnesty to anyone going back, and then asked these 7 questions, with the later ones depending on the answers to the first ones. 1. Will you voluntarily be repatriated to North Korea or China? 2. Would you forcibly resist repatriation? 3. Have you carefully considered the impact of such action on your family? 4. Do you realize you might remain here at the camp quite some time after those who choose to go home, go home? 5. Are you aware the UN cannot guarantee that you will be sent to any specific place? 6. Are you still determined to forcibly resist repatriation? 7. What exactly would you do if you were repatriated in spite of this decision? During these questions, if at any point the POW says he'll accept repatriation, the questions stop. If he says anything, though, like he'll try to escape, or he'll fight to the death, or he'll commit suicide rather than go back, he is then separated and put into another compound of such others. Well, the actual screening itself goes smoothly, but there are big problems. There are 7 compounds holding 37,000 North Korean communists, or supposed communists, and their leaders will not let the screening team screen them. And in one of them, a fight breaks out between POWs and ROK guards. ROK is the South Koreans, which leads to a rock fight and then to a machine gun. 4 of the guards and 3 prisoners are killed, and 4 more guards, 1 American officer, and 60 POWs are wounded. Thing is, despite these guys' opposition, like half of the 132,000 total military POWs are screened in the first 3 days. And, well, the results are nothing short of amazing. Of like 60,000 screened in those 3 days, over 40,000 of them say they will violently resist repatriation. 2/3 of them. Now, I went over the pre-screening estimates last week, and the UN figured they'd end up sending back like 116,000 of the 132,000 POWs. So even should they send back all of the so far unscreened ones, along with the 20,000 or so that have agreed to repatriation, it's going to be way less than 116,000. This really shows the depth of feeling of the POWs about the lives they do not want to return to. But it sure does dim the prospects for an armistice. They don't even bother to screen those North Korean compounds. They just put all those guys in the repatriate enclosures. But they do spend the rest of the week screening the rest of the military and then the civilian POWs they hold. They are almost finished as the week ends, and I am very eager, as I'm sure you are, to see the final results. Whatever the common soldiers in the communist armies feel about their former lives, the communist leadership appears to be unwilling to change tack. The enemy was stronger and better prepared by April 1952, but still not eager to change the tenor of the war. As long as there was no break in the negotiations and there were no outstanding pressures on the battlefield, the communists appeared ready to continue their present tactics of defense at the front and attack in the discussions and in the propaganda field. The UNC, on the other hand, pursued the defense all along the line, with the possible exception of the air and sea war, and even these could be termed as much defensive as offensive. And behind the UNC lines, other problems, produced in part as byproducts of the static war, came to light. One thing that has become a problem for the UN, both on and away from the battle lines, is ammunition. Now, at the end of 1951, UN Commander Matt Ridgway took a look at the ammunition expenditures for the summer and fall operations, and he was quite disturbed. He called the enormous rates of fire either extravagant waste of expenditure of ammunition or misuse of artillery, or both. He told Van Fleet he did not want it repeated in the new year, since excessive use of heavy artillery burdens U.S. industry and uses up raw materials. But this pisses off Van Fleet. He does not feel his army has wasted or misused ammunition, and he warns Ridgway against comparing the situation with any from World War II, telling him, based on World War II European standards, I estimate the 8th Army is short approximately 70 battalions of field artillery. Hence, the greatly reduced intensity of field artillery battalions per mile of front has required more rounds per individual tube to achieve the effectiveness required. The effectiveness of one volley from 4 battalions is far greater than 4 volleys from 1 battalion. He goes on to say that, sure, he uses loads of artillery, but if he tried to take any of their objectives with limited artillery, the 8th Army casualty lists would have been way, way higher. And who wants that? And anyhow, he conserved a lot of shells starting in October when things grew really static. Washington does not think they'll be able to improve supply numbers in the calibers that are short until late 1952. The time lag between obligating funds for ammunition production and the delivery of the finished shells was emphasized during early 1952. Despite the fact that billions of dollars of contracts had been let, the end result in many cases was still 6 months or more in the offing. Far East Command has a problem explaining shortages to Congress and to the U.S. general public. Little is happening at the front, but Army Chief of Staff Lightning Joe Collins still thinks ammunition expenditures are too high. He pointed out that of the $3.5 billion requested for all Army procurements for the next fiscal year, 2.5 of that is for ammunition. He asked Ridgway last month to see whether they could make major reductions, unless major fighting resumes, and Ridgway assigns that task to Van Fleet. Okay, they have not inflicted a lot of casualties on the enemy so far this year, right? So this makes all the artillery they've been using look like pretty high expenditures. But Van Fleet reminds Ridgway that the past few months, they've only been using 60% of what they've been allocated. Heavy mortar ammo is under strict rationing, and that cannot be reduced further. Van Fleet says the only area they could realistically reduce is interdictory fire against things like road intersections, supply bases, and communication hubs. But 2/3 of 8th Army's missions are for interdiction. Just 20% is counter-battery fire, and the other 15 or so for meeting enemy actions. Van Fleet can order interdictory fire cut by 20%, but he will not do more than that. This week on the 9th, Ridgway tells Collins he's increased his 1952 ammunition costs to just over $1 billion. He does say that Van Fleet is cutting 20% of his interdictory fire, but he also really gets down to the kernel of things. And he tells Collins, it still seems to me the most fundamental factors in this problem are the ones most frequently obscured by the search for economies. Those factors are that we are at war in Korea and that ammunition must be provided to meet essential requirements, both of expenditures and stock levels. Provided these requirements are reasonable, economy ceases to be a factor. The only alternative is to effect savings of dollars by expenditure of lives. They are indeed at war, and the war on the ground continues. The first raid by units of the 1st U.S. Marine Division against the Chinese forces in West Korea, since the Marines moved here the other week, happens when this week begins the 8th. Well, it happens that night, kicking off at 10:30 p.m. and lasting until the morning. It's a company of the 5th Marines, and when they get past the outpost line and encounter some Chinese, there's pretty fierce fighting and maneuvering in the dark for several hours. Both sides each take like 19 casualties, though more Chinese are actually killed than Marines. But though the Marines take no prisoners, they do get some intel. The Special Action Report says they find well-camouflaged firing ports and positions along trench line. The enemy was aggressive, but seemed over-anxious, which permitted friendly recovery patrol to close with enemy and work back to base of fire. Talked and yelled to each other consistently during the fight, which gave friendly patrol advantage in spotting them. Something happens today, the 14th, of import for the Marines' future defense and deployment in the region. Now, over the past couple weeks, I talked about defensive ideas and manning the MLR and OPLR, main line of resistance and outpost line of resistance, and that the Marines are stretched pretty thin by being responsible for around 60 kilometers of front. Well, today, elements of the 1st Marines take over Canadian positions at the Saint-Michon River, and this really does create a manpower problem. 1st Marine Division Commander John Selden decides to stop manning the OPLR. To him, it's too much of a drain on manpower. Instead, he will beef up the MLR and increase the reserve behind it. However, frontline battalions will have to have all their companies at the MLR, and beyond that, there will be a few permanent combat outposts that can be manned and supplied from the MLR, but the OPLR is to be abandoned. I have mentioned a couple of reasons why Van Fleet wanted the Marines moved over here from the mountains of Central Korea, but there's still more to it, and it has to do with inter-allied relations. I know I haven't mentioned them for a few months, but you remember the Commonwealth Division, right? This is made up of British, Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand combat units, plus the Indian Hospital and Ambulance Unit. Last October, in Operation Commando, they fought their way forward to the Jamestown line, and now here in April, they still hold their advanced positions. Here's the thing. Their commander, James Castles, is pretty particular about which other 8th Army units he wants on the flanks, and he prefers to not have American Army units there. Castles actually preferred to have the 1st ROK Division on his flank rather than a U.S. Army division. Under British pressure, Van Fleet retained the 1st ROK Division in the 1st Corps, but shifted it to a sector on the right of the Commonwealth Division. The 1st Marine Division went into the sector of the 1st ROK Division when the Marines went west. The Commonwealth and 1st Marine Divisions operated with mutual respect to hold their portion of the Jamestown line. Both divisions believed they were much better off without Army divisions on their flanks, and both worked well with ROK units with the U.S. 1st Corps. Whether they are better off or not remains to be seen. But that will happen in the future, for this week of the Korean War is over, with the Marines taking the fight to the Chinese, an ammunition shortage that doesn't seem to have a ready solution, and tens of thousands of POWs saying, I don't want to go back. Also, remember a couple weeks ago I said that Ike, NATO's Supreme Commander and an American World War II legend, Dwight Eisenhower, was considering a run for the American presidency. Well, this week on the 11th, he tells current President Harry Truman that he wants to resign or be relieved as SECUR, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, so he can return to the US from Paris and run for president. I'll tell you what Truman says as soon as I get the word. 40,000 out of 60,000 POWs would violently resist going to North Korea or Communist China. I'm pretty sure no one saw that coming. That says a lot about a lot of things. But I cannot see the communist side being enthusiastic about this, and can see it playing hell with armistice talks and pushing an armistice further down the road. But remember, every day that the soldiers and Marines remain here, men on both sides, is another day that a bunch of them die. And the days just keep adding up. Well, who knows how much longer I have to cover this war. But I will do it week by week, and I do that thanks to the Time Ghost Army. For it is the army that allows me to do so. You too can be part of this adventure and join the Time Ghost Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Tomi Karineho. I'm guessing it's a Finnish name, and tell me if I'm pronouncing it wrong. I'm sorry, Tomi. Tomi Karinaho. Thank you. I've got good staff here. Say hi.
Hi.
Tomi Karinaho is the Army Member of the Week for this channel. These are the newest commissioned officers. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.